What's up, class? Hope you're totally excited to talk about Module 9, Objectives 3 and 4, because without further ado, I am going to talk about that. Okay, so here we are with Objective 3. I want us here to recognize and give examples of upstream and downstream determinants of substance use. So these are terms that sociocultural researchers look at, and these are mainly, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned it prior, but these are mainly sociologists. So this comes from a sociological tradition that, again, looks at broader aspects. Sociologists look at culture and society. Psychologists tend to focus on the individual more. Okay, so this is sort of the psychologist's realm. It's the downstream factors here, and the sociologist's realm is the upstream factors. These are the larger macro drivers of substance use and addiction. So let's look at some of those are. For example, we've touched on some of them in the last video, things like laws. We're going to talk today about some of the laws regarding opiate use that have regulated, use of opiates and opiate prescriptions in the United States and stuff like that. Those are the upstream factors, right? It's not what individuals are doing, but it may influence substance use and addiction in an indirect way, right? Systemic discrimination, things like the crack versus cocaine laws, for example, inequality in general that's going to create situations where people are more likely to use substances. For example, minority stress we talked about last time. Downstream factors are more typically sort of psychological factors, lifestyle choices, neighborhoods, behaviors, things like that. So upstream factors often go unrecognized. And I think you'll see that when we talk about an example of the opioid epidemic. Downstream factors get a lot of attention. So take a look at this graphic that I put on here that are talking about why addiction occurs in the case of the opioids. And they say chronic exposure to opioids may result in brain abnormalities. Well, we know this is dysregulation of that dopamine system, right? And these brain abnormalities can lead to addiction, also known as opiate use disorder. Notice those are downstream factors. It really doesn't talk about availability of opiates and how, for example, our government may contribute to some of those factors that make that use more likely, and then cause the brain abnormalities, and then causes substance use and addiction. Okay. Also, when we think about treatment, we generally think about downstream factors, right? So how can we reverse those brain changes and things like that? And I'll talk about one of the problems with the upstream factors is they don't really inform treatment quite as well as we want them to. But anyway, nonetheless, they are very important. And it's important for practitioners to recognize that there are all these drivers, these upstream factors, which are political and societal factors that are going to affect the use of drugs. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the upstream factors as determinants in the opioid epidemic. And in particular, so I'm going to use this as kind of a case study of some of the upstream socioeconomic determinants of the opioid epidemic. The one that I'm going to talk about is poppy production in Afghanistan. So poppies are used to make heroin. And production of fentanyl and the chemicals that go into fentanyl in China. I'm going to talk about, and more recently in Mexico, I'm going to talk about recession and unemployment in 2007, 2009, and that was what we call the Great Recession, happened when the housing bubble burst in 2008. I'm going to talk about the politicization of opioid medication, medications to treat drugs. I'm going to talk about the pharma industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and how they changed some of the prescribing practices. I'm going to talk about overprescription by doctors of opiate pain medications, OxyContin diversion to drug dealers, pharmaceutical industry lobbying, and the fact that the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Agency, became weakened. Okay, so first things first, talk about skyrocketing opium poppy production in Afghanistan. What happened is that Afghanistan became a major opium producer following the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. So there we had a situation in which the Taliban, who was in charge, had kind of gotten a handle on poppy growing. So poppy is a flower, and again, it's used to make opiates like heroin. And what happened is that after our invasion of Afghanistan, the production of heroin went up a lot. And it was because there was like a ton of poppy growing. So you can see in green there, that's what's the amount of opioid production in Afghanistan in those years following the invasion. And then in red is the rest of the world. So you can see Afghanistan was accounting for a huge amount, right? Well, once you increase the production, what's going to tend to happen is that the prices are going to get lower. And what that resulted in is quite inexpensive heroin in the United States. Heroin had always been very expensive, and now it becomes inexpensive because there's a huge supply of it. So that's an example of that, one of those upstream factors. Cheap heroin is going to make a user more likely to use, which then is going to cause the downstream factors, right, from there. Okay, another issue is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a drug that is used medically, but it's also sold illicitly. So it's produced both for medical reasons, but it's also produced illegally. Well, it turns out it's a fairly easy drug to produce, and the chemical makeup of the drug, it's a synthetic opioid, so it can be produced in a lab, and those chemicals are fairly easy to get and widely available. What happened is that there was a lot of production of illicit fentanyl in China, and then that fentanyl was exported into the United States. And now Mexico has picked up on a lot of that. There was a market in the United States for a lot of reasons by that time, and we'll talk about some of those. Many people were addicted to prescription drugs. Well, fentanyl comes along, and it's like 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, which we talked about in an earlier chapter, another opioid, and it's quite a bit more potent even than heroin. It's super, super potent. And because of that, it's both highly addictive and really, really dangerous in terms of overdoses, because lots and lots of people overdose on fentanyl. So fentanyl, it turns out, can be made, because it's made in labs, it can be made really cheaply. And on top of that, it can be distributed really cheaply because you only need very, very small amounts of it. So, for example, right now, I just read a story of what they call drug mules that are coming over the Mexican border. These are not Mexicans. They are Americans who can pass freely through the border, right? And so go over to Mexico and they pick up drugs, and a lot of times they're holding those drugs in their bodies somewhere, right? And then they walk across the border or drive across the border or something like that. And those drugs they're worth a lot in the United States. They're typically getting people who are really on the down and out, and they're giving them like $500 to cross the border with a whole bunch of fentanyl, because again, it doesn't take up a lot of room, and so you can get it through pretty easily. What they often do is mix it in with other opioids, and they make it into pills that look like prescription drugs. And so there's also some confusion about whether you're getting something that was a prescription drug originally, or whether it was produced as illicit fentanyl. Well, again, the production goes up. Whenever you get production up, you're going to get prices going down. It's about $10 to $20 per pill. It has got really, really cheap. It's really, 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 really powerful. And again, lots of overdoses. So again, this is another upstream factor. It doesn't have to really do with what the individual is doing, but it's a factor that makes drug use far more likely in society. Another thing that happened in 2000, around 2007, we started to see an economic downturn that just hit the ceiling when a bunch of banks crashed in 2008 because of bad loans that were made for housing. And so a lot of times this era is called the Great Recession. We had a massive economic downturn, unemployment skyrocketed, lots of people lost their jobs. And what we saw along with this was a lot of emergency room visits for opioid-related problems and many, many, many overdose deaths at this time. Those deaths largely occurred among middle-aged white men with low education levels. And the idea was that, here, men who had been privileged largely through society were now facing real problems, and there were many deaths by substance use, and also suicide, and which sometimes are hard to distinguish. These were called at the time deaths of despair, and you may see that around. That may, in fact, be a sort of racialized terminology. My guess is they probably wouldn't have called it that if it was a Black thing, but you make your decision there. Anyway, the idea is that people were in the down and outs, and they were more likely, because of this economic downturn, to turn to drugs. Okay. Next is the politicization, that's a hard one, of opioid medication production. Okay, so this is the legal production of opioids as prescription drugs in the United States. And what happened is that the US federal government made some huge changes in their regulation of opioid drugs. And at first, what was happening is a number of different agencies and pharmaceutical companies, and we'll unpack that later, convinced the US government that patients were untreated for pain, or that we had a shortage of opiate drugs to treat patients for pain. And part of that was because opiate drug production had been regulated, because it was recognized that, for a long time, that opiates led to problems with addiction. But then what happened is, because the government was convinced that there was a shortage, they deregulated it. And then, as you can see, starting in 1994 and up through 1996, and we're going to see this massive increase in opioid prescriptions. And so that's going to peak at about 2011 and then start to decline again. So the market got flooded with opioids, and then the federal government then started regulating again due to this problem of many, many people addicted to opioids. So we started to get that downturn there after we started getting some regulation. But so there was like this rapid changes in government response that may have fueled the crisis, is what I'm saying. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what happened with the pharmaceutical industry, because the pharmaceutical industry worked hard to get physicians to prescribe more opioids. And so there was a movement in the 1990s that pain was undertreated, that people were in pain, and it was a major medical problem, and that it was not being treated. And there was the Purdue Pharma, which was a name of a pharmaceutical company, started making an opioid medication for long-term use. So this is for chronic pain, somebody who's in pain for a very, very long period of time. And they would just take this same opioid all the time. And the name of that drug was OxyContin. And it turned out that that drug became very dangerous. But why did that drug result in so much addiction? Well, there were a number of different things. One was a very, very aggressive promotion campaign to doctors. And what they basically were campaigning to doctors and saying, look, there's no addiction risk here. We don't have the problem of addiction here. You don't have to feel guilty about prescribing this drug. And they even invented this term that doctors had, which was opiophobia, right? Which is people were afraid of opioids. Doctors were afraid of opioids, but they shouldn't be. They should prescribe them. They should treat pain. Patients are in pain, and it's their responsibility to treat that pain, right? Well, they were deceiving doctors with regard to the addiction risk, and they did know. The company knew about the risk of addiction, but nonetheless, they weren't telling doctors about it. On top of that, they were basically paying doctors to prescribe. Now, if you've ever had contact with a doctor, my mother was a psychiatrist. And so I used to go sometimes when I was a kid on these trips with her, right? And she would be, I mean, wined and dined by pharmaceutical companies. Believe me, they would walk around with platters of champagne all the time at these little events, and there would be outrageously good food, and you could bring your family and all this stuff. So what was that doing? I mean, they weren't paying him in money, but they were paying him in travel. They were paying him in these wonderful, ritzy receptions and things like that. What did they want in return? They wanted you to prescribe their drug. And if you prescribed their drug, they made money off of patients. We started to see a massive increase, and so here's this same kind of graph that I showed you before that looks at this sort of increase in opiate prescription use. In 2011, you can see that peaks there for opiate prescriptions. OxyContin was approved in 1994. That was when that very aggressive marketing campaign started. TJC is called the Joint Commission, and they provide standards for hospitals and things like that. And they were quite involved as well, because they were saying also that you need to treat pain better, that in fact, if patients are unsatisfied, then we are going to grade down your hospital, and then that gave you fewer resources. So at any rate, to keep patient satisfaction up, that people were trying to go with these TJC standards. And anyway, we got a massive increase in opioid prescriptions. Well, Purdue Pharma, again, that company, enlisted physicians to deliver presentations about opioid medication. So they actually hired physicians, doctors themselves, to give presentations. And in those presentations, they downplayed withdrawal symptoms, addiction risks, and way overplayed the benefits of prescribing these opioids. And physicians started just jacking up all their prescriptions, just going up and up and up. And you had many people who were very high intensity prescribers, and those were the favorites of the pharmaceutical company. They were getting all kinds of travel deals and stuff like that. And they had many, many patients who became addicted to opioids. Another problem was the problem of OxyContin being diverted to drug dealers. So pharmaceutical companies, there's some rules and regulations for pharmaceutical companies. They're required to notify the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, if there are orders for the drugs that seem kind of shady, there's some suspicion that maybe the drug is going to go to the black market. So some entity comes and tries to order a whole bunch of OxyContin, and they're trying to order a lot of it at once or something like that. That if there's something shady about it, then the company, Purdue Pharma, would have to report that to the federal government. But Purdue Pharma didn't do that for an entire decade, 10 years. They didn't report anything. And they did a lot of shady deals. So there was probably a lot of OxyContin that was being sold on the street at the same time. Again, upstream factors that made the availability so high for this stuff. Okay, another issue was pharmaceutical industry lobbying to politicians now. So these big pharma companies like Purdue Pharma, they spent a ton of money on campaign contributions and lobbying to politicians. And just take a look at the industry comparison here, and you'll be blown away. This was in 2020 on this graphic. I mean, pharmaceutical manufacturing are putting a ton of money into lobbying and campaign contributions. In 2017, over 90% of Congress had accepted pharmaceutical money for their campaigns. Over 90%. I mean, think about that. That's a lot. Almost every politician in Washington had accepted some of this money. And the money, I mean, when they pay for, when they give money to a campaign, and they give to both Republicans and Democrats, believe you me, the money, what do they expect back from it? Well, they expect lack of regulation of their industry so that they can sell more OxyContin and other opioid drugs, right? So they don't want this legislation that's going to regulate the opioids. And these, of course, these politicians are indebted because of this campaign contributions. Okay, finally, the Drug Enforcement administration becomes weakened, and that happened in 2016 with an act called the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act of 2016. It was passed by Congress. It was signed by President Obama. What it did was weaken the DEA's ability to block opioid shipments. Now, they could still do it, block opioid shipments to the United States, but it was a stricter regulation on blocking those, so it made it harder to block those. And, I mean, are you surprised by this? If 90% of politicians in Washington had got pharma money, like, duh, okay. Anyway, I just thought I'd do a little epilogue on what happened to Purdue Pharma. It was originally owned by a billionaire family named the Sacklers, and they eventually were prosecuted for their selling of OxyContin and deceiving doctors and all of this stuff that I've been talking about. They were ordered to give up control of Purdue Pharma. Now the company is called NOAA. They are no longer, the Sacklers are no longer in control of it, and it actually provides addiction treatment medications, which is pretty awesome. Purdue Pharma was also ordered to pay $6 billion to states and victims of the opioid epidemic. And the Sackler family personally paid $3 million. Well, these are like billionaires, so that wasn't like that big of a deal. You just sell a mansion or something like that. Actually, they did sell a mansion. Anyway, then on appeal most recently, and that was in 2022, they were awarded legal protections for the Sacklers, so that will shield them as independent people, not the company, but as people from opioid-related lawsuits. So they're not going broke anytime soon. They're actually still one of the wealthiest families in the United States. If you get a chance, and I haven't watched it, so I can't really endorse it, but there's a series on Netflix that's called Painkiller, and it tells the whole story of the Sackler family. Okay, well, what are some of the limitations to sociocultural concepts? The concepts are providing helpful insights, but what do you do with treatment? What are you supposed to do? Right? I mean, when it comes to treating an individual person, you almost have to go for those downstream factors, because you really don't have you're not going to go fight a pharmaceutical company to deal with somebody's drug use problems. You know what I mean? Upstream factors like poverty, for example, are just really difficult to change. And I think sometimes we feel stymied on how to change those. So I say, as future treatment practitioners, if you're going to be one, this is sort of one of your obstacles. You see this stuff, you acknowledge this stuff is going on, but on the other hand, can you use it in your treatment? And I think that is a good critical thinking issue for you. Okay, main take-home points from Module 9. Sociocultural theory plays a role in our understanding of addiction. We cannot ignore these upstream factors. We also really need to look at, how addiction is interpreted, how drug use is interpreted from the people who are using the drugs. Stigma exists. It is a problem. Terminology and labeling matter. We know that from experimental studies that change one word and all of a sudden get totally different responses from people. Substance use may serve important non-pathological purposes of social communion with one another, of taking time off from a crazy society or a very busy set of obligations. There are upstream or broader determinants of drug use that influence the price and availability of drugs, which are going to, in turn, influence use of drugs. I hope you guys are inspired and have an awesome day. Bye.